thank you all very much for coming along to this, the final in the many installment laden series that has been the POLSIS seminar series over the course of the year. I would almost go so far as to say that we have saved the best for last, because today we're fortunate enough to have Professor Graham Harrison from the University of Sheffield, where he has worked for the last 12 years, I believe we established, which is a testament both to his own quality in terms of rising through the institution there, and also the fact that we like Sheffield very much as well, I would think. Professor Harrison is an expert in development, an expert particularly in East Africa, where he has spent a significant amount of time over the course of the years of his research, picking up some local languages along the way. But what he's working on particularly at the moment is the question of how Africa is represented over here, because Africa is, of course, what it is in itself, but Africa is also a thing towards which we have policy of our own, based upon some of the imperatives and ideas that emanate from our own society as well as it. So the talk that he's going to be delivering to us today is focused particularly on development campaigning within the United Kingdom and the prospects for Africa in that regard. We're very lucky to have him, and thank you very much. I thank you very much for coming to talk to us today. Professor Harrison, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for that remarkably warm introduction. I have about 45 minutes, is that right?
You do.
Okay. Let me just write down the time so I don't get... Okay. Good. It's lovely to be here. I've not been in this building before. There's a little bit of sun shining on you all, and there's a nice healthy attendance level, so I'm very excited about sharing these ideas with you. It's a bit of a, let me give you a short, kind of very short biographical context. My kind of CV, paper trail, publication trail, tends to talk about various aspects of African political economy in various ways. What I'm going to talk about today is something a little different, and it's an outcome of a piece of research I've done. Despite being spectacularly bad at winning any funding for it, I've just kept doing, and has led to a book just about to be written up in final form. And in a sense, this paper is a more contemporary and a little bit more of an open set of ideas based on that book. And the book is about the way Africa has been represented in the British polity over quite a long period of time. But telescoping towards the present, and particularly looking at the ways in which development campaigns have thought about engaging with the British public, and for that matter other institutions, and the role of Africa therein. So today I'm going to talk about development campaigning, and I'm going to do so in a way that focuses on a particular aspect of, if you like, contemporary and very live discussion within campaign organisations about how development campaigning should work, or perhaps how development campaigning can be improved. And I'll come to that a little later on. But let me start with a brief bit of context here. Really, since the mid-1980s, but perhaps in a kind of ratcheting fashion, the large development NGOs in the United Kingdom have become increasingly powerful broadcasters of development knowledge. And the campaigns that British NGOs have taken on have, I think, fairly self-evidently become better at addressing the public in some form or another, of making issues about international development seem familiar within British spaces of public discussion. This is something that has happened as these NGOs themselves have grown, and it's something that has happened to some extent in tandem with a prioritisation of questions of international development, both in terms of global governance and indeed in terms of UK government policy. So when we think about the ways in which development campaigning has changed and what kind of questions one might ask of it, that piece of context is actually very important, that these NGOs have become larger and more effective in broadcasting their messages. But nevertheless, at the same time as this kind of ratcheting of power, if you like, representational power is happening, NGOs have become increasingly aware of the fact that they don't have quite the monopoly over the way development is represented within British public spaces. So what we see now is both the growth of NGOs as campaign organisations, as organisations wishing to disseminate ideas about development, in tandem with an increasing focus on thinking about development issues by the British government. And one of the kind of key things that DFID does when it's created is to try and increase a sense of what it called at the time global citizenship, introducing aspects of development thinking into the curriculum, commissioning the Office of National Statistics to do all sorts of development attitude surveys, and then creating glossy literatures and web pages and so on about international development. Roughly speaking, that mandate has remained the same in the context of the present government. So we see a growth in governmental attempts to represent development to the British public. We also see the growth of, again, none of these are entirely novel, but I think the significant growth in the efforts of, if you like, celebrities to engage the population with issues to do with development. The most famous, infamous two examples being Bono and Bob Geldof. But around those two also a growing coterie of different, often very different, groups of celebrities, however one might define that word, who have engaged in various kinds of development campaign or branding, if you like. Also, the rise of the global social justice movement, or the anti-globalization movement, call it what you will, in the 1990s, and the incorporation of aspects of development agendas by that movement, and its rather awkward commingling with the traditional development campaign sector, and the rise of corporate philanthropy, the super rich increasingly trying to dedicate certain amounts of money to development projects, or projects of trying to be concerned for the distant poor, if you like. Most obviously the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and the commitments it's made to the Global Fund, but then a whole series of other commitments, and kind of big, powerful media events talking about the responsibilities to the global poor from the global rich. All of this, if you like, creates a kind of milieu in which actually all of these different agencies or institutions interact, often very awkwardly. But the outcome of this is that NGOs, which in the early 1980s thought of themselves almost as kind of the representational agencies of development, find themselves in a world that is increasingly networky in terms of the way representation takes place. One of the other contextual issues which I think is important and will hopefully make sense as we go along is the fact that development practitioners, NGO campaigners in the United Kingdom have become increasingly, if you like, self-aware. There is a really clear sense of an epistemic community amongst the large development campaign NGOs. The people who work in those large NGOs, Oxfam, Save the Children, and Action Aid, Christian Aid, CAFOD, they all know of each other. They often move between different institutions. They all share a language of what campaigning is. They all share, although they obviously diverge in some ways, they all share common values of one kind or another between issues of debt, between issues of aid, concerning things like trade or HIV or poverty and how one deals with chronic or mass poverty. And also, if you speak to these people and if you look at the kinds of policy documents and discussions that these NGOs are creating, you see that there have emerged in the 1990s a whole series of meetings. The NGOs themselves produce consultancies of the sector that try to create strategies and strategic questions around what development campaigning should be. And there is a language there that campaign workers use to reflect upon their own role, to reflect upon the prospects, the campaign prospects that their own organisation has. And also, within this epistemic community, there is clearly a sense that development has become more complex. From the rise of the NGO in the United Kingdom after the Second World War to the present day, you can see it, roughly speaking, to be rather caricatured about it, a move from the famine appeal to quite complex messaging and quite complex political deliberation about what one does about large levels of international debt, or what one does about mass murdering diseases, if you like, AIDS, tuberculosis, malaria, what one does about connecting things like the arms trade to questions of development, and so on and so forth, particularly in regards to trade, quite complex debates about what a developmental trade campaign might look like. Okay, so there's the context. Let me now be honest and give you the kind of the kind of core argument here. Development campaigning is complex. That's a really kind of evasive thing to say. Everything's complex, but I hope to come back and say something about why that's interesting to say. This is because institutions representing global poverty are multifarious, and because British society is seen as more complex than previously. I think this is a really important point, because there is a large development campaigning sector in the United Kingdom. It is not easy to understand this campaigning sector as in any sense a single unit. And when you think about the way in which campaigning happens as practice, it is very readily apparent that actually the extent to which campaigns work or fail or have strategic goals attached to them partly only makes sense in terms of reconciling the fact that campaigning has to address different audiences, different social groups, people with different political identities, and so on and so forth. This becomes, I think, very relevant later on when we think about development campaign strategy. Thinking about the way the distant poor are represented needs to recognise this by developing campaign strategies that strategically recognise plurality. And I'm going to develop that argument by looking particularly at the concept of framing. And I'll go on to say why I think the notion of framing is important in 2 slides' time. So, before I do that, I want to make some comments about the role of Africa in all of this, because, as I say, the research I've done has kind of been focused particularly on the way Africa is represented. And there are some reasons, I think fairly good reasons for doing that. First of all, in the United Kingdom, there are general popular associations of Africa with the big developmental issues, particularly poverty and aid. If you look at the kind of mass surveys that the Office of National Statistics and other consultancy companies have done, that produce a great screed of kind of, frequency responses to questions and graphs and so on and so forth. If there is in any of this material a spatial fixing of any of the developmental issues which are raised in these surveys, it is sub-Saharan Africa. And the more detailed and less large N surveys that some NGOs have done, which have been based on focus groups and on more complex forms of question, it becomes very clear that when people think of development issues, they are almost always thinking, if anywhere, of Africa. And the association of Africa with famine, particularly, seems to be extremely resilient. So development campaigning, if it has a spatial fixing, if it has an address, if you like, if the distant others come from a particular place, it tends to be Africa. This is reflected in the association of Africa with these kinds of issues here, which is both part of a kind of cultural legacy of the United Kingdom and also both part of the fact of the matter. Actually, a great deal of the world's poverty and conflict and general kind of humanitarian crisis is concentrated in Africa for all sorts of reasons. So, what I'm going to do in the rest of the talk is talk about development campaigning, but in terms of thinking about issues of representation, in more or less explicitly, I'm thinking of Africa's role in all of this as a particular place. I think it's so ideologically infused with issues of development. To speak of Africa, that you can see these as, if you like, a Venn diagram in which development and Africa intertwine very closely indeed. But I want to focus on framing as a way of thinking this through. What I'm trying to do is think about the increasing institutional complexity of development campaigning and what that means for effective development campaigning, or what that means for the strategies of development campaigning. And I want to introduce at this point the concept of framing as a way of doing that. After I've talked a little about framing, I'll come to a particular dilemma that hopefully will then allow this to focus in and make more sense in terms of what I think campaign organisations might consider to be a better strategy for thinking about development campaigning. Framing. As I said earlier on, campaign communities in the UK have become increasingly self-aware. NGOs have become increasingly professionalised in the way they employ people. And there are discussions amongst campaigners about what campaigning is and what's good campaigning and the values of campaigning. And this often involves talking about framing, often in very loose ways. Framing can be used almost as a metaphor, something quite fungible and workable as a way of saying, well, the way we're framing this issue is as follows. And that's useful for day-to-day work. But it's also the case that framing comes with an academic history. In the study of social movements, originally in the United States, the notion of framing is borrowed from sort of social psychology to move researchers' attention away from materialist approaches to understanding social movements, materialist in the rational choice sense rather than the Marxist sense, in which social movements are supposed to be these kind of aggregations of costs and benefits, where people feel that joining a movement is a good idea because they're likely to get an outcome, but there are costs involved in committing to it. And so a lot of ideas about social movements are represented in these kind of rational choice models and concern themselves with free riding and this kind of stuff. And this is intrinsically quite limiting. It may have some forms of basic heuristic value to talk about that. Clearly, people do think about costs when they're sitting through interminable meetings about campaign strategy, and that might make a difference to the extent to which they commit, and so on and so forth. But there's obviously a lot more going on in any kind of social movement or campaign than simply the utilitarian balancing of time spent and rewards expected. And framing tries to draw attention towards the more, if you like, symbolic or aesthetic aspects of the way social movements emerge, and I think by implication also the ways in which campaigns work. It tends to focus on identities, people's political identities, or the identity of a campaign. It tends to focus on the symbols and imagery of the campaign itself, the ways in which you might disseminate a campaign idea strikingly through the use of image. And framing also tends to focus on the ways in which these images and these identities produce a sense of what we are, in the sense that each social movement has to have some form of collective identity that can often be articulated through a shared set of common values and aesthetics, and also then adversarially against an external antagonist of some kind, a government, a group of corporations, or whatever it might be. And the gist of the notion of framing is that actually these things matter, and they render rather approximate at best the idea that people think purely in terms of calculation, and that actually identities and commitments to certain kinds of values produced through symbols are very important. This fits in very well with an increasing focus on the imagery used by campaign organisations, particularly from the mid-1980s, when NGOs become very insecure about the ways in which they have used images to develop campaigns and appeals for money. This largely focuses around the Band-Aid, Live Aid moment, and the fact that between those two events, an interesting thing happens, which is that there is an unprecedented amount of public awareness about Africa and about at least the notion of a famine in Ethiopia, that this gets kind of, if you like, made a generic issue about Africa as a whole, extremely problematically. And it does so through the kind of very, very strong connection between some campaign organisations and some celebrities, and a very kind of, again, buy-in from the media, particularly the BBC, and the dissemination of very simple imagery, very, very shocking imagery of sub-Saharan Africa. And this is a really important moment for campaigners, because in a way what happens at that moment is both success and problem. Band-Aid, Live Aid produce a massive amount of money for NGOs. It produces a real spike in membership of campaign organisations. It puts Africa on the map, if you like, in terms of British mass public culture. But it does so in a way that relies upon images that are seen in retrospect as demeaning, facile, and in ways that produce at best fleeting moments of attention from most people who give money or attend concerts or whatever else. The Band-Aid thing then leads to a sense that the imagery matters because it produces a kind of strategic dilemma between mass appeal and very, very simple, high impact or shock images, and limited appeal, but more, if you like, politically representative images of sub-Saharan Africa or of the campaign organisations themselves. And I think that this strategic dilemma between shallow and broad and deep and narrow has come back again quite recently and has been articulated very explicitly through the notion of framing. So I've gone a little bit off the PowerPoint there, but I've got to the gist of it, so that's okay. Framing, let me see. Yeah, so framing, so framing has been something that's become increasingly common in the parlance of campaign organisations. The thing that very briefly to mention that I think is particularly important in the literature on framing for understanding campaigns is a kind of triad of components to the frame, the way campaigns represent, if you like, themselves to themselves and to others. And that is the idea of a diagnostic, a prognostic, and a motivational frame, in which an organisation represents a problem in a specific way, poses a sort of particular solution to that problem that obviously is its solution, and then develops some sort of narrative about why people should care about that problem and solution, and motivational frame. And if you look at campaigns that have rolled out over time, I think in every case you can find a sense in which there are these three framings within every campaign, in fact. And it produces almost a way to understand the ways in which campaign organisations attempt to speak to or to address a broader public. The diagnostic, prognostic and motivational. There we are, back on track. I want to make 2 points about framing, which I think are really important and identify areas in which the notion of framing analysis is quite limited. And then I want to say something about why that allows campaigns to think beyond this dilemma of narrow, deep, broad, short, in which success seems to come at the cost of thinking seriously or in a sophisticated manner about how Africa or the distant poor are represented. There are 2 things I think that frame analysis to date hasn't done that well. It's not to say it hasn't done it, but it is to say that it hasn't done it very well. And if this bullet point thing had been working, then it would have said introverted and presentism, which is a word, I checked it in the dictionary. And I'm going to talk about those too. Framing tends to be, the way in which people have talked about framing has tended to focus on the way in which campaign organisations and social movements develop images of their struggle or their political cause for their own communities in order to establish a we, to use that kind of a language, if you like. A way in which the cause makes sense to members or people very close to the organisation. It has a lot less to say about how campaigns address different kinds of people in any public sphere who will have very different forms of current awareness of a campaign or engagement with a campaign or sympathy with what a campaign claims its values are. The research also tends to assume the existence of causes. It tends to start, it's a very empirically focused area of research. It tends to start with a social movement or a campaign organisation and then look at what it's doing. As such, it tends to mention issues about historical precedent or whatever, but not to take them particularly seriously, not to put them, if you like, into the core set of research questions or research agendas within which you understand a particular campaign organisation. And this, I think, is problematic. It's problematic because unless you think about the ways in which framing engages with broader publics, and unless you understand the ways in which framing has an historical precedent, that there's no such thing as a new cause or a new campaign in the sense it is generated through a longer and more complex history, you end up stuck on the horns of this dilemma between being popular and, if you like, between being popular and clever or popular and sophisticated. And this dilemma is something that is very explicitly set out in a report by a consultancy company called Andrew Darnton and Associates called Finding Frames. It was commissioned by DFID originally, but also has Oxfam money in it and has been kind of housed within a coalition organisation called the British Overseas NGOs for Development Bond that now encapsulates a large number of very, very influential campaign organisations. And last Monday there was a kind of dissemination workshop on this document, Finding Frames. And it's very, very interesting, very well written, addresses all sorts of issues, some of which I've mentioned just now. And it explicitly uses this idea of framing in its discussion. And it sets out very clearly this idea that what's happened with campaigning recently is that it has lost its sophistication and it's lost its values. The story that it tells is one of really, I think, an analogous story to what happens after Band Aid, Live Aid, which is that as a result of the awkward success of Make Poverty History, campaign organisations have lost their sense of identity and their sense of what their values are, because what made Make Poverty History successful was the increasing tendency of that campaign to buy into a very, very simple and very, very populist idea about what campaign engagement was. The NGOs that were involved, the campaign organisations that were involved in Make Poverty History, bought into a quite highly celebritized model of what development campaigning was. The focus of Make Poverty History became very condensed in terms of its time frame, and the kind of appeals to action, the motivational frame of Make Poverty History tended to be the click, the text, or the white wristband. And what all of the organisations involved in Make Poverty History found, even before the end of 2005, was that these simple acts of affinity, if you like, did not lead to anything after 2005. There was a sense of tangible deflation after 2005, in spite of the fact that throughout 2005 there was, I think, pretty much according to all the surveys, an unprecedented awareness in the public sphere of the campaign itself. Make Poverty History's brand recognition was around 80% according to some of the surveys of the British public, and that's never really been equalled in as much as you can talk about those kind of survey pieces of evidence. So in a sense, I think there's an interesting analogy there with what happens after Live Aid, that there's a sense that it's worked, but what have we sold? A rather Faustian sense that something has been lost from the values of the campaign. And what happens after 1985 is that the big NGOs work very hard to develop a sense of what good campaign imagery is, and they have a code of conduct, and it talks about positive images and human faces, and tries to think about Africans in the context of communities, Africans who are working, in other words, are not emaciated and isolated famine victims or victims of war and displacement. It tries to present more complicated stories, often narrated through semi-fictional livelihoods of particular people, particularly African women farmers. Get a whole kind of growth in African women farmers' life stories in campaign materials. But what's interesting about that is it all happens, and it produces a kind of quite rich development narrative that's supposed to engage school children, development campaigners, peoples in confessional communities, in churches particularly, and so on and so forth. But absolutely running in parallel with this is a persistent famine frame, a persistent resort to the imagery of famine by all of the major NGOs, a persistent reliance upon the child image, which is seen as being particularly problematic throughout the 1980s and throughout the 1990s. So what happens, and indeed into the present day, so what happens is, in fact, that there's a code of conduct about what good representational practice is, and it is adopted at the same time as those institutions are also talking about adopting a child, talking about giving money to save a life, this kind of very, very simplistic idea of paying to save a life that just doesn't go away. Very, very clearly, it doesn't go away. And what this does is suggest that campaign organisations do and can disseminate incommensurate frames. And I think that the reason why this is important is because if you think about framing as something that is done within an institutionally pluralised context of different campaign organisations with different goals, and it is trying to address different kinds of people for different kinds of reasons, then it is at least strategically possible to think about frames that don't necessarily fit into some single meta-narrative. And in doing so, to move towards a possible place where it is possible for a possible place where it is doable for campaign organisations to not worry about the either-or question of shallow or deep, popular or narrow. The objectives of each different frame matter, and the commensurability of different frames doesn't necessarily have to be a problem. Rather than rehearsing this, which is what the finding frames thing does, rather than rehearsing this anxiety about being liked or being clever, it is possible to think about frames in a more multifarious fashion. And I think, I think the way to do that is to focus on the way framing engages people. In other words, to take this largely introverted framing sensibility and change it to something that is more extroverted by introducing the idea of engagement, rather than thinking of framing as a way of saying what our values are and who they are that we're struggling against and what kind of aesthetics we find pleasing, to think about how framing appeals to groups who are more or less distant from the campaign itself. And if you do that, you come up with I come up with a typology which seems to make sense when looking at campaign materials myself. And there are five ways of thinking about engagement in this respect, which have different repercussions for framing. One is vitalising existing memberships of campaigns to recommit to deep involvement, which I'm calling for shorthand commitment. Secondly, appealing to those who've been involved weekly in a campaign and encouraging them to be more involved, which I've called migration towards, although in interviews actually a lot of campaigners use this language as well, of migration. Thirdly, appealing to those in cognate campaign areas to bring their existing commitments into a new campaign area, migration across. One of the things that's interesting after Make Poverty History is that the Global Coalition Against Climate Change, more or less emerges, follows some aspects of the Make Poverty History Coalition, and then there's a whole discussion about the extent to which these two mobilised communities are, if you like, sharing values or sharing people. Migration across then becomes an issue, whether you would expect those who care about the environment also to care about chronic poverty or mass poverty. So migration across, appealing to specific groups who are currently not involved in campaigning, but who are in some sense civic or charitable and could become lightly involved in campaigning organisations, which I've called Infiniti. This group one might roughly categorise, to use the words of one campaign organiser I interviewed, as nuns and mums, people who are it's assumed to be, so they're rather absurd, romanticised category, obviously, a gendered category, but assumed to be, if you like, morally virtuous, caring people who might want to become, relatively lightly involved in a campaign because of their faith or because of their sort of sense of being part of a community, and so on and so forth. So that I call affinity. And then the fifth one, populist appeals to all to make simple, discrete acts of affinity to a campaign. That sounded really gobbled when I read it out. Garbled. It's the idea of a very populist appeal that has simply the goal of people making a very simple, straightforward, brief commitment to a campaign. So the classic Make Poverty History idea of clicking or texting or buying the wristband, I've called that recognition. In itself, it has a kind of validity as long as the expectations are that it achieves nothing more than that brief moment of recognition. Incidentally, as I was writing this, obviously the whole Joseph Kony thing was kind of going on, and this gives you a very almost maybe unprecedented example of how rapidly those kinds of very simple commitments can take off and reach, across very large numbers of people very quickly. These five different forms of engagement open up different ways of thinking about the ways that frames and campaign frames engage with people, producing different expectations and producing, roughly speaking, different understandings of which kinds of people the framing wishes to appeal to. What I hope it does is break down this dilemma between being liked and being clever, if you like, that campaign organisations rehearse through these kind of awkward moments after campaigns are successful, but seem to produce relatively limited changes. I have about 5 minutes.
Sure.
Well, that makes it sound like you mean 10 minutes. Yeah, sure.
Let's say
5 and a
7.
bit? 7, okay. Because I want to make one point that's on a bullet point before going back to a kind of conclusion, which is that one of the things in the research that I did on the way Africa was represented that was very striking is the endurance of certain kinds of references about what Africa is. in terms of what Britain is, if you like. These two things are highly reflexive. The way Africa is represented is as much about what the people doing representing think Britain is, as it is a reasonable account of what's happening in Africa, or a particular part of Africa. And in the historical institutionalist literature, there's this kind of relatively recent notion of layering that seems, at least metaphorically, quite useful in understanding that. But even if you go back to the original campaign, which was abolition in the late 1700s, you can see how the way Africa is represented bequeaths certain tropes, certain frames of reference, then for a broader anti-slavery movement, and then a broader set of concerns about colonialism, partly advocating it and partly critiquing it, and then right through into the post-war concerns with development and famine and so on and so forth. It's not that there's a sort of rigid frame that never changes throughout all of this history. That's clearly an absurd proposal. But there is a real genealogy there. There are real sinews of continuity amongst all of that change. And the point about recognising that is that actually, the idea that the aspiration for a campaign organisation is to create a globally minded British citizenry seems remarkably ambitious, even though it is what campaign organisations often aspire to. I think it behoves campaign organisations to think very modestly about what they can do, even with this remarkable now machinery of public relations that NGOs can use. The ability to address and problematise and re-engineer, if you like, public values in regards to sub-Saharan Africa or Africa more generally, I think are very limited. So in a way, at this stage, my conclusion is there are five ways of thinking about engagement that open up different ways of thinking about frames that have to address a multiplicity of different constituencies within the British polity in ways that are relatively modest. And I think that, if I said that in an NGO forum, wouldn't be particularly popular. It wouldn't be popular regardless of the intellectual merits of all of this. It wouldn't be popular because it tends to be rather pessimistic about what's possible. And one of the ways in which a community of campaigners can function is by tempering the pessimism of the intellect with the optimism of the will, of saying another world is possible, of seizing upon a development issue and seeing what the political right is in regards to it. There are some very self-evident campaign ideas about making trade justice work or making antiretrovirals cheap that are kind of almost impossible to argue against. And those drive campaigns. So I think there is a need to introduce a sixth way of thinking about engagement, one which does have a broader ambition to it. And that's the one that I call populist appeals to all, to encourage people to think differently about development. And this idea is quite close to what the Finding Frames document moves towards. But what the Finding Frames document does is say that this is something we need to move towards holistically as an organisation. And what I think what I am arguing, is that if this framing process is feasible, it needs to be connected to a sense of an appropriate engagement strategy. It can work in conjunction with these other ways of framing, even if these other ways of framing are incommensurate. And if there are times where you can try and change people's values on a broad scale by problematising assumptions about development, or being fairly adversarial against the government or a particular organisation, then they have to be connected to a very clear set of values and a very clear set of strategies. And I think there's one obvious strategical starting point for this, which is the coalition. That when campaign organisations work in coalition, which is occasional and often very difficult, the Jubilee 2000 campaign, in some ways the Make Poverty History campaign, stand out. There's also a trade justice movement that is sophisticated but less well known. Then there is this possibility of using this sixth form of engagement, of trying to disseminate something very, very broadly that has within it political ambition. But as I say, it isn't an either-or question. It is rather, when is this appropriate, and how do we strategize it? The Finding Frames document has a set of values connected with it, which are really important, partly because they open up a set of workable reference points, normative reference points as to what campaigning is about, that move the coordinates of campaigning away from consumer-like and highly branded forms of appeal, where you maybe buy a particular thing, or you know, in a kind of very aspirational way. This is very prominent in the Coney campaign, but extreme rather than exceptional. This is sort of, we are the world, we're the young, we can put a poster up and we can make a difference idea. Campaign organisations have really seized that idea. It comes from public relations and the commercial sector. Aspirational kind of ideas. It's about moving away from those and trying to recover values about responsibility, dialogue, humanitarianism, and so on, justice and mutual support. And the reason why these values are important is because if these kinds of campaigns, of broad campaigns, are going to work, it is highly unlikely they're going to work unless they network into this kind of milieu of different institutions of representation I mentioned earlier, that they connect with government, that they connect in some way with notions of celebrity. There are all sorts of interesting discussions about that, and then they get the media on board in some way or another, whatever one might mean with the media. So these kinds of values, I think, need to be maintained in connection with this particular kind of way of thinking about engagement. And I'm really bad at writing conclusions. Sometimes I read out the last paragraph and hope it sounds suitably like an ending. So I'm going to just do that, and then I'm just going to see what we make of it, I guess. Yeah, so this sixth framing does not necessarily have to be a universal mood. In other more usual circumstances, frames might have more modest, consolidating, migrating, affinity or recognition tasks. As ever, British political culture, and indeed the nature of development issues, is in a state of flux. Having a suitably diverse repertoire of framing strategies seems to fit this situation rather well. That's it. Thank you very much.